So Trent, you did a study talking with about 25 podcasters, podcast producers, podcast agencies across 108 podcasts. So they receive a lot of pitches. The general synopsis, first of all, the pitching community, how are they doing?
Not so great. And this is backed up by the data that we saw within the report, but definitely within some of the anecdotal responses we received as part of the survey as well. And if I were to boil it down to maybe one sentence or a few words here, it's a high volume, high noise, low signal environment currently. There's a lot of reasons for that. Well, you can unpack those reasons, but certainly one of the big through lines with this is AI and how that's playing into destroying inboxes worldwide, not just with our podcast production friends, but across basically every other discipline within the business sector now too.
What I like about this study, because I've heard the same comment, of course, multiple times, stop playing a volume game, stop just using AI. But you went deeper and started understanding from some of the respondents, and full disclosure, I was one of the respondents. How did they identify that something is a pitch, first of all? Never mind that it's AI. How do they see that it's a pitch? In how many seconds or milliseconds are they identifying it as a pitch? And what is their emotional response to the pitch?
Yeah, listen, there's so much competition in inboxes regardless. And now you add podcast pitches on top of that. And I think the one response that really caught my attention, and I'm going to read it verbatim just so your audience has a little bit more insight here, but the core disconnect is that bookers often view podcasts as a distribution channel for their clients, while producers view their shows as sacred spaces for their audiences. Now, I think that line in particular is something that I've seen as being somebody on the other side, pitching folks. I receive pitches too, even though I don't even host a podcast anymore, which is another kind of through line with all of this research that we did. But when we think about a podcast, right, versus a traditional media outlet, a newspaper, a trade rag, TV, radio, etc., I think we've taken for granted in a lot of ways, like how important media is to conveying messages to public broadly, right? And the interesting thing about podcasts is they are such more of an intimate platform. When you think about the rituals and routines which podcast listeners conduct on a daily basis, whether it's them getting ready, them on the treadmill, them doing chores around the house, their commutes to work, this is really me time. And I think that producers' response about podcasts being the sacred space is something that if there's one thing that pitchers could take out of this entire study, it really is the sacred space. Because as you know, having produced scores and scores of podcasts over the years, to get somebody to, one, give up their time and attention, and two, keep coming back to that same kind of core content with a podcast, it's very difficult work. And I think there's a perception among the broader PR media relations world that podcasts are sort of this rising star, this cresting wave. But thinking about it as a sacred space where somebody's devoting time, attention, oftentimes a lot of money into the content they're producing, like it really does become a sacred space, not just from the podcaster side, but also from the audience's side as well.
And suddenly I'm equating the value of my podcast to me is something similar to the value of my dog. Yep. Someone pitching my podcast feels like is it okay if I feed your dog? This is a pitch that I got yesterday, Wednesday, January 21. We're recording on the 22nd. Hi, first name. Making sure you did not miss this story. Trent, this is just an example of the stuff that I get all the time. Other examples are when they're circling back to remind me that I haven't responded to them, because sorry, I don't. If I'm not interested in the pitch, I don't say, hey, thanks, but it doesn't quite, I don't want to engage in that because I lose 15 minutes of my day every time, and I just don't have that. But they'll circle back and say, hey, put this one, I know you have a busy inbox. That's the trend right now. I know your inbox is full. I'm bumping this one back up to the top. Pitches that are 2 full paragraphs in length. Again, there's too much emotion invested in the podcast for me to go through that. What did you hear about successful pitches? What are the ones that break through? I know my comment in particular was to break the pattern, just a psychological heuristic, be the blue M&M in the bowl of red M&Ms.
Yeah, relevance was first and foremost. And I think so many times relevance is just viewed as, I have a guest that talks about the topic that your show talks about. That's not relevance. Like, that's table stakes. And when we went a little bit further and kind of pulling out some of the details here, the key insight is the pitcher should demonstrate that they actually listened and they understand how the podcast wants the audience to feel. And so when we talk about emotional states, as we did in that last question, you have to really be empathetic about this, right? So if you've got a show that is more of like a how-to practical level style of content, that's not going to have nearly as much emotion, but you can pump up emotion within that. So the example that I'll always give is, maybe you're a software development firm and you help with custom integrations between HubSpot and Salesforce migrations, whatever. You can, insert any variables you want into there. Well, yes, you can give a step-by-step instruction on how to properly migrate from HubSpot to Salesforce, but what's actually going to be relevant in understanding the emotion that the audience is going through or the emotion that they're experiencing is, man, it really, really stinks when you're trying to do mission critical work to grow your business, but you can't get the right data from your old platform into your new platform. And that's how I would kind of wedge that angle into it. And I think that was reflected in a lot of these responses that we received.
Okay, there was one table that I want to share that it kind of, if I'm reading it right, it sort of surprised me. What are these stats specifically showing me? Is this because my response rate, I think, is below 1%.
Yep.
But it sounds like it sounds like I'm a jerk. And it sounds like the response rate is actually a fair bit higher than that.
Yeah. And I will say with this, so we looked at two different metrics, response rate as well as acceptance rate or yes rate, if you will. And then we looked at the range. Yeah, we looked at the range of percentages, and then we looked at the median of that range as well as the average of that range. So
got it. If
we're looking at the response rate range, that range from 1%, like yourself, all the way up to 90%, which was a small independent show, very niche. And as a result of them being very niche, they really only get very niche pitches and very niche guest requests. So if we look at that range, 1% to 90%, the median response rate is going to be 17.5%, and the average is going to be about 27.8%, call it 28%, right? I think that's roughly in line with what we've seen, plus or minus maybe 5 to 10 points either way. And truthfully, probably more so on the do not reply side of things. But I think one of the very clear takeaways as part of this was how many podcasters and production agencies and producers themselves will actually blacklist certain domains because they've received an ungodly amount of unwarranted contact with irrelevant pitches, irrelevant guests, very low level types of outreach plans. So again, response rate is going to be on average 27.8%. I would say from my own personal experience, that's probably closer to about 15% roughly. And then again, on the yes rate, so getting somebody to actually say, yes, we want to have your guest on the show, that range is going to go from less than 1% to on the high range, 40%. Now, again, that one small independent podcaster is the one that's saying yes to 40%. And again, having done some research on their show, it's a very guest-driven show. So the median yes rate is going to be 5%, and the average yes rate is going to be about 10.6%. And again, this is roughly in line with what we see from my experience having run a guest booking agency where we're booking about 80 clients per month as guests on podcasts. 10% is a good hit rate, especially for maybe PR agencies that are only now just dabbling in podcasts. They might not have a fully dedicated podcast guest booking division yet. They might not be fully, fleshed out in terms of their service offering from that side.
The notion of abolishing spray and pray, if I can. When I look at your stats, and there's a huge range, but it sounds like there's a roughly 10% hit rate for a response. And we're saying, look, listen to the podcast, understand the narrative, get to know the podcaster. That takes a lot of time. That takes a lot of investment. What would you bump the needle to? 20%? Is that worth it? Is maybe volume is the way to go. Maybe I continue to spray and pray and my numbers actually come out better. It's like cold calling or cold emailing. I don't spend any time getting to know, but I cold email and I get results. So I just want to challenge we morally and ethically and semantically prefer don't spray and pray, but in sales, sometimes spray and pray works.
Unfortunately, yes, and that's why I think we see this continue. And there's no signs of it slowing down, despite new Gmail filters coming out where they're auto-detecting automated messages, despite that bad pitch that you received, mail merge things just not working. Right? It's still, if you're a PR person and one client wants to be on podcasts and they also want to be on all of the traditional, TV spots, radio spots, newspapers, so on and so forth, and you've only dedicated 5% of your time to podcasts, well, why would I take more time to do podcasts and do thorough research on shows when it's only making up a very small sliver of my overall client portfolio, right? And that's a reality of the PR agency world. It's a reality of the guest booking world. I do think, having talked with so many podcast guest booking agencies over the years, they tend to do something a little bit differently, and I think that's why they have a little bit more staying power and oftentimes outperform some of these PR agencies with global reach and Madison Avenue accolades and so on and so forth. But these guest booking agencies often very narrowly define what types of clients they work with, and as a result of that, they build very strong relationships with podcasts in that space. We've got a great recommendation if anybody needs a podcast guest booking agency, Spencer Carpenter with Outlier Audio. Mm-hmm. He stays very skinny in terms of which types of clients he works with.
Dynamite. And if you're shooting for the bigger podcast, to understand that, use Podchaser as your tool. It's a phenomenal tool. I'll say it and save you the pain of it because we use it. It's a phenomenal tool to understand what podcasts really are creating in their space. There are a lot of big talkers, pardon the pun, and it sounds like their shows are kicking it. Do the research to understand that. And Podchaser is a phenomenal tool for that. Trent, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks, Doug. Appreciate you.
Thanks for accepting my pitch to do the YouTube video.
Of course. Yeah, no, this is awesome.